Hello, friends, and welcome to Lesson 7 of Unit 1, which is the last lesson. So far, we have discussed business environment. After that, we discussed political environment, and we discussed about the government intervention, the economic environment, the industrial policies of India, and then we also had a good debate on economic planning and reforms. And today we are going to discuss monetary and fiscal policy. Under monetary and fiscal policy, the learning objectives are economic cycle, recession, monetary policy, and the fiscal policy. Let us start with the economic cycle so that we can understand the recession. When we talk about the economic cycle, it is also known as the business cycle. So when the GDP is growing, you are in the expansion phase. Then you reach a peak, after which the GDP keeps on coming down, and that phase is known as recession. And if it goes beyond a certain level, the GDP, for consecutive quarters continuously, then you go into depression, and then that is the trough, that is the rock bottom when you reach. And from there you start the recovery, and then you come into the expansion where the GDP grows, benefiting the citizens, then again the peak, and then the recession. So this is how the business cycle is, and we'd like to focus more on recession. So what is a recession? In the recession, GDP goes down. As a result, the income level falls. When the income falls, people tend to buy less, so the sales fall. If the sales fall, the production falls. And when the production falls, the employment falls. So this becomes a vicious cycle wherein everything is connected, and until you don't break this cycle, you go into depression. So what are the symptoms and effects of recession? Firstly, when we call a recession, maybe the GDP is going down, but then again it starts recovering. But when the GDP declines for 2 or more consecutive financial quarters, we call that as recession. So for example, in the first quarter, GDP has shrunk by -1, and in the second quarter, GDP has gone down by 1.2%. For 2 quarters, it has gone down. So then, as I said earlier, the income level goes down, people stop purchasing more, and as a result, production goes down, businesses suffer. When the businesses suffer, they don't open up the jobs, and they also ask people to leave. So this becomes a cycle until you don't come out of recession. In the recession, unemployment rate rises, consumer purchases fall off, businesses go bankrupt, people lose their homes if they are mortgaged. Young people can't get a good job after school, GDP declines, and the share market, you get bearish trend. Now, how to prevent recession? That's very important. And that is where we'll talk about the two policies, the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. So, how you can prevent the recession, what steps you take, and wherein what the government has to do. So there are different policies to avoid the recession. Generally, they are divided in 4 areas. First is the monetary policy, Second is the fiscal policy. Third is the higher inflation target. And fourth is the financial stability. Our focus for this lesson would be on the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, which we'll be discussing in detail. There is one term which is helicopter money, which is a rescue policy, wherein the central bank, like in India it is the Reserve Bank of India, gives the money to the government, right, to be used during recession, and the government may or may not repay. Generally it is not to be repaid. That is why it is called helicopter money, as if you are throwing the money from the helicopter without accounting for, or later on waiting that this will come with some interest, or whether it will come back or not. Now when we talk about the two policies, that is the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, both are governed by the government, so that is where the government role comes in the economy during recession. So how the two policies help in curtailing recession, that is what our aim would be. So in the monetary policy, it is the amount of money supply in the market and the economy, that is what is done. And here the instrument with which you play is the interest rate. So the monetary policy is used by or advocated by the central bank, which is the Reserve Bank of India, whereas the fiscal policy is governed by the political party who is ruling at that point of time, that is the government. For the fiscal policy, you have the taxes and the government spending. So remember, monetary policy, the tool is, the instrument is interest rate, and for fiscal policy, it is the taxes. So let's start with the monetary policy. As I said, this is governed by the central bank, which is the Reserve Bank of India, if we talk about our country. So there are four things you have to look at. As I said, the instrument is interest rate. So basically the focus is to increase or decrease the aggregate demand. Aggregate in terms of the total demand of the country. So there are three things we need to look at. One is the interest rate, which is the instruments. So the Reserve Bank of India increases or decreases the interest rate depending on where we stand. And as a result, if we increase the interest rate, there will be more inflation. As a result, there will be less money supply. Money will be less in the market. So the borrowings will go down, savings will go up. So let us understand that very clearly in very simple terms, the monetary policy. So generally the monetary policy has two types. One is the expansionary monetary policy and the other one is contractionary monetary policy. So one is for expansion and the other is you're trying to contract or reduce the money supply. So when you want to increase the money supply, so this is in the case of recession. So there are four things which will happen. Again, basically we would like to increase the aggregate demand. If the aggregate demand is more, there will be more production, there will be more jobs, more income, and then more spending. So you try to break that vicious cycle that we discussed of recession. So with the interest rates, that is what RBI plays with, they lower the interest rate. So when they lower the interest rate, what happens is the borrowings go up and savings go down. When the savings go down, there is more money, so people will spend more, consumption goes up. So the investment goes down. and the exchange rate goes down. As a result, the exports go up. So that is very important to understand. So when the borrowings go up, the investments go up by the businesses so that they can produce more. That is from the business angle. So when GDP is growing, there is a lot of money, you want to curtail the money, you want to have better savings. So what you do, you increase the interest rate. You want to contract the money supply. So you want to reduce the aggregate demand. So as a result, what happens when you increase the interest rate? The inflation goes up, the savings go up, the borrowings go down, and there will be lower investment. So that is how the monetary policy is played by the central bank. Excuse me. So how this transmission takes place, what is that mechanism of the monetary policy? So first thing is you change the market interest rates. So when you change the interest rates, it directly affects the borrowings and the saving rates, as we saw, which has the impact on demand. So based on that, when there is effect on demand, either the demand will go up or go down, that will affect the output jobs and investment. And that will affect the GDP and the inflation. So this mechanism takes 12 to 24 months for the full effects on real GDP and the inflation rate after we change the interest rates. So it is not that we do it and within 1 month you can see the effects. It takes 1 to 2 years. Generally, the monetary policy, there are certain target rates which are kept by Reserve Bank of India in mind, like unemployment should be kept at all times below 6.5 and GDP should grow at least by 2 to 3% and the core inflation should be between 2 and 2.5%. So these are the three parameters based on which the RBI takes the expansion or expansionary method or the contractionary, where they want to reduce the aggregate demand. So they keep these target rates in mind. So when we talk about the fiscal policy, again fiscal policy is advocated by the government and it plays with the taxes, increase the taxes, decrease the taxes and the government spending. Again, it is for expansion or contraction depending on the aggregate demand, whether to be increased or decreased. So when we are talking about recession and we want expansionary policy type, so in that what we try to do is we reduce the taxes so the businesses can flourish and we try to spend more from the government side. So that way we are trying that the money goes into the market and from the government side there are jobs created and there is investment by the government in the economy. So when we want to reduce the aggregate demand, so what we try to do, we put more taxes and we reduce the government spending. So through the fiscal policy, government plays through taxes to expand or contract the economy. If I want to compare the monetary and fiscal policy in terms of around 7 parameters, First is the tool. So as I said, monetary policy is working on interest rates, whereas the fiscal policy is on tax and government spending. The effect of changing the interest rate will be on borrowings and the savings. Whereas in case of fiscal policy, it will be the budget deficit. So all the money that comes to the government is through taxes, and once they go for the budget, so they want to use the same amount of money for the budget which comes from the taxes, or they want to borrow some more. And we will talk, or you will study in your financial courses under MBA, the fiscal deficit and the budget deficit and all those terms. Third is the distribution. So when the money supply is more or less depending on which tool you are using. So for example, higher interest rates where you are trying to contract the economy, that will hit the homeowners but benefit the savers, because with the more interest rates the savings will be more and they will be saving more on the higher interest. So in case of fiscal policy, it depends which taxes you raise. So there are many different types of taxes, direct, indirect taxes, under each there are different categories. So it will depend on the taxes. Exchange rate. So higher interest rate cause appreciation. So whereas in case of fiscal policy with the taxes, there is no effect on the exchange rate. On the supply side, limited impact in monetary policy. On the fiscal policy, so you have higher taxes, it will affect the incentives to work. Politics. So monetary policy is set by the Reserve Bank of India, and the fiscal policy is the government, by the government, which is the ruling political party. Liquidity trap. In case of liquidity trap, any cut in interest rate may or may not, but generally may not work in liquidity trap. What is the liquidity trap? That means that when you increase the flow of money in the market, it is not that as a result of that the interest rates will increase over a period of time automatically. So it is not like that. So it may not, so if you cut the interest rate, so it is not that the liquidity will increase. In case of fiscal policy, we use fiscal policy when you are in very deep recession. Otherwise, you work with the monetary policy. So that is all for this unit, where we discuss the economic cycle, the recession, the monetary policy, and the fiscal policy, which are the tools to prevent the recession or to come out of recession. Well, friends, here is a small quiz. So keep your notebook and the pen ready, or you can put your answers in the chat box. Recession occurs when GDP declines for how many consecutive financial quarters? Second question, export increases in which type of monetary policy? Monetary policy is set up by whom? You can check your answers. Recession occurs when GDP declines for 2 or more than 2 consecutive quarters. Export increases in expansionary monetary policy. Monetary policy is set up by the central bank, which is Reserve Bank of India in case of our country. If you have any questions, feel free to write to me at gjmt@gmail.com. If you want to go further and you would like to have some articles on the topics that we discussed in lesson 7, these are 2. One is rethinking the monetary and fiscal policy for positive development, and second is fiscal policy during the time of the pandemic, because we are going into depression, and when you go into deep recession or depression, you have to work with the fiscal policy. So this article is all about that. That is the end of Unit 1. So once again, let me look at all the lessons that we have under Unit 1, starting with business environment. Talked about external, internal, macro, micro, and then we took up at the macro level the political environment, and under that the government intervention, then the economic environment, then under the economic environment the industrial policies, and the economic planning, which are long-term plans, and the reforms. And especially we talked about 1991, where we said the new industrial policy or new economic policy changed everything for our country, and from there on a new direction has been given to the economy of India. And lastly, we discussed today monetary and fiscal policy. Now here is something which you will enjoy doing. These are takeaways from each lesson. There are 7 lessons, so there are 7 takeaways. They are not in the order in which they should be, depending on the lesson. So for lesson 1, which is the takeaway out of the 7 on the right, you have to match. For lesson 2, match. Lesson 3, match. So I give you some time to match, like for business environment and its components. Is it recession? Is it free market economics? Is it 5-year plan? Is it efficiency and equity, excuse me, external and internal, or fundamental rights, or LPG? So please match, and then we'll check the answers. I'm pretty sure you have done a good job. Please check the answers here. So business environment and its components. So takeaway was external and internal, where we talked about the control that the business has over those components. Political environment, we did talk about the fundamental rights. Government intervention, 2 basic goals, efficiency and equity. Economic environment, we talked about free market economies. Industrial policy, we talked about liberalization, privatization, and globalization as LPG. Economic planning and reforms, we talked a lot about 5-year plans by the Planning Commission, and now it is 15-year plan by Niti Aayog. And in the monetary and fiscal policy, we talked about recession and how to come out of recession, and what are the policies which can be used for that. Well friends, thank you very much. We finish Unit 1, and in the next class we'll start with Unit 2. And bye for now. See you soon.